In Isaiah 53, there's a line that says, "He was despised, and we esteemed him not." Now, Christianity has always claimed these words to be a description of Jesus. But I was thinking about this and I thought, really, is it actually true? And if it is true, how much of it affected his life? You see, Jesus was actually a child prodigy. He was very, very clever on religious matters. So he wouldn't have been despised and he wouldn't have been not esteemed as a child. On the contrary, would have been highly, looked up to, and, the clever kid, So he wouldn't have been despised and he wouldn't have been not respected as a child. It's quite obvious from all the accounts in the Gospels that Jesus was very highly thought of. He had followers. Everybody was coming to listen to him, and most people were praising him, saying how fantastic he was, right? So, is this actually true? And if we believe it is true, what's made us think that it is ascribed to Jesus? Well, unfortunately, the death of Jesus, in common with millions of people, millions of men, was not a very nice death. I suppose in many people's deaths, a person can be despised and not very highly esteemed, especially in war, when people are executed, killed, murdered, they are despised and they're not very highly thought of, right? But the church has given the death of Jesus the greatest publicity that any person who has died has ever had. In fact, the manner of his death and his dying has been the most publicised death in the whole of history. The actual gruesome details of his death have been broadcast all around the world for thousands of years, and it is the most well-known death and manner of death that's ever existed, that's been broadcast around the world. Who has not heard of the details of the death of Jesus? Right, that horrible death of being whipped, ridiculed, mocked by soldiers, then crucified, and no one's saying it's not a horrible death. Of course it's a horrible death, but have you ever thought that there's millions of other people in this world that also have had horrible deaths, humiliating deaths, deaths where they've been mocked and ridiculed? You do research with the Holocaust and you find accounts of people who've been humiliated and mocked before their deaths and suffered terrible deaths. You find this in the reading accounts of the First World War and the Second World War. You find this with prisoners of war. You find throughout history, unfortunately, when you do your research, that people do an awful lot, millions and millions of people have suffered awful, excruciating deaths where they have been, before their deaths, put down, humiliated, treated abominably, and despised, and then put to death. How many people reading those words, "He was despised and we esteemed him not," would think that those words perhaps applied to them and to an experience they'd gone through in their lives. How many people incarcerated in prisons, treated inhumanely and tortured and all sorts of horrible things, would read those very words, "He was despised and we esteemed him not," and say, "That just sounds like my life. That just sounds like what I'm going through." And so I'm throwing this open because we do have to question whether those words do actually apply to Jesus. In terms of poetry, if you're thinking of words that would describe the suffering of Jesus at the point of his death, with the day of his death, the whippings, and then being mocked while he was on the cross, those words would be attributable to that very moment of being mocked on the cross and the pain and humiliation, etc. As a poet, you would say, well, those words probably describe that Jesus' death. But what I'm saying to you is those words, "He was despised and we esteemed him not," would also describe millions upon millions of other people's lives. Just their lives. Their whole lives from beginning to end, and even the manner of their deaths. In other words, we can't isolate those words and say they solely belong to Jesus. And in fact, because the church has highlighted the death of Jesus and they've chosen those words particularly to attribute and describe and to link with his manner of death, it is easy for people just to assume that those words are meant for Jesus. Those are descriptive of Jesus. But we have to look at Jesus' life as a whole and say, do the words, "He was despised and we esteemed him not," does that apply to the whole life of Jesus? Well, the Gospels account would say not. This is a child prodigy. This was a child who would have been pampered and probably spoilt because he was so clever in the Jewish community. He would have been highly respected. He was highly sought after and respected as a preacher. People were hanging on his words. He had followers, both male and female. So in fact he actually wasn't despised and not respected the majority of his life. In fact, 99% of his life, Jesus was respected and esteemed and not despised. It was only that 1%, the last probably the 24 hours of his life, where he was having a hard time of it, to put it bluntly. Yes, he was mocked, he was ridiculed, and he had a horrible death. But how many millions of other people have been in the exact same position? And how many other millions of people have spent their whole lives being despised, rejected, and mocked? And in fact, doesn't this describe very much the history of the Jewish people? Not least, ironically, of the treatment by the Christians over the centuries, who have despised and esteemed the Jewish people not. They've constantly, throughout the centuries, despised and esteemed the Jewish people not. It's always the Christians. It's no other people have despised and showed such a lack of esteem and respect for the Jew as the Christian. So this is quite ironic that those words are possibly in terms of the percentage of the Christian Jewish history, is that the Christians have despised and esteemed not the Jewish people most of the time. And the percentage is much higher. It's not 1% of history, it's a considerably higher. What is it? Could it be 75%? Possibly yes. Yes, it's very high percentage that the Christian has treated the Jew in history as we reject you and we despise you and we esteem you not. And on balance, I would say that those words apply more of a description of the persecution of the Jewish people by the church than an actual overall description of the life of Jesus, because it's quite obvious from the gospel accounts themselves that Jesus was not despised and he was not as regarded with a lack of esteem. On the contrary, this was a man who had hundreds and hundreds of people hanging on his every word, who had women, who had disciples, who had people following him, who was a celebrity of his day. And so we have to question the evidence and ask, what does really ring true? Was he despised and esteemed not? Or are those words perhaps more a description of the church's history, long history, of its attitude and treatment of the Jewish people?